Our next company that will present will be Calliditas Therapeutics, and I will leave the word over to the CEO, Renée Aguiar-Lusander, for the presentation. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for joining me for this presentation of Calliditas. As mandatory, the first page is the forward-looking statement page, as we're a public company. In terms of Calliditas Therapeutics, we are a business that focus on the orphan space with a special focus on kidney and liver indications. Our lead product candidate is called Nefecon. It's being developed in an orphan disease called IgA nephropathy, which is an autoimmune disease of the kidney. And we're in the midst of running a phase 3 trial, which is planned to read out top-line data this year in Q4. We listed on the Stockholm Exchange in June of 2018, raised about $82 million in the IPO, and we have cash as of Q1 of about almost $75 million in the bank. And we have a broad shareholder base that encompasses both leading Scandinavian as well as international shareholders. So IgA nephropathy is an autoimmune disease of the kidney. It's a progressive disease that in up to 50% of the cases leads to a risk of developing end-stage renal disease, requiring then assistance in terms of either dialysis or transplantation. What we are quite unique about is that we are the only company globally that's actually targeting the origin of this disease. Because even if it's a kidney disease, it actually starts in the gut, not in the kidney. And so we are delivering our medication to the gut with a view to be disease modifying and really affecting the origin of the disease. Second thing that makes us quite unique is that actually we are also the only company globally that's had a successful phase 2b study in this indication. It was a very large study, 150 patients, pan-European study in over 62 sites, and that result was published in The Lancet in 2017. And finally, we're also the company that's been leading the charge in this indication from a regulatory pathway perspective. We worked very closely with Tufts University and University of Utah to develop a statistical framework, which we brought to the FDA in January 2017 to actually get their agreement that we could use a surrogate marker, which I will come into more later in the presentation, called proteinuria, for conditional and accelerated approval in Europe and the US respectively. So this was the first time the FDA actually agreed to that as far as we're aware. And that framework is now being used by the FDA for all companies who are looking to make progress for the patients with this disease. There's nothing approved today in IgA nephropathy, nothing in Europe, nothing in the US. It's a really significant unmet medical need. This is a large indication. It's a large, rare indication, I guess I should say. And if we look at the actual clinical situation, so IgA nephropathy, as I said, is an autoimmune disease of the kidney. There's a genetic predisposition that's required, but it's not sufficient. So it is triggered by either environmental, bacterial, dietary triggers. And what we know is that it's generally diagnosed in people when they're in their 20s and 30s. And we know that it's a fairly slow-moving disease. And for that perspective, it can take 10 years, even up to 20 years for these patients to actually end up in end-stage renal disease. But we also know that the vast majority of these patients who go into dialysis have not yet turned 50. So they are young and otherwise healthy apart from their failing kidney. And we know that this is a problem that occurs in up to 50% of the diagnosed patient population. So the way that this is kind of managed today is that all these patients do end up with a nephrologist. So it's a specialty physician who will look after them. They will see this physician several times a year and will be followed in terms of proteinuria, so protein leaking into the urine or blood leaking into the urine, as well as their underlying kidney function, which is measured by eGFR, which is the glomerular filtration rate. So as I mentioned, the actual prevalence of this disease, we did our own prevalence study in Europe, resulted in about 4 in 10,000 cases. So that translates into about 200,000. And we're estimating the US market to be about 130 to 150,000. As you can see in Asia, this is not an orphan disease in Asia. This is very prevalent, particularly in China. Actually, IgA nephropathy is one of the leading causes for end-stage renal disease in China as a whole. So looking back and talking a little bit about the pathophysiology, so what we've said is actually it is a kidney disease, but it starts in the gut. So as you can see here, it's in the distal part of the small intestine where there is a concentration. So actually, as you might know, the vast majority of our immune system is in our gut. And there's a specific concentration of something called Peyer's patches in the distal part of the small intestine called the ileum. And these are the kind of lymph nodes, if you like, who produce these IgA antibodies. These are secretory antibodies. They're meant to stay in the lumen and to look after what comes by there. But in this particular disease, these IgA antibodies find themselves in the circulation. And as they do that, they're considered to be foreign bodies because they have an underglycosylation in the hinge region. There's a lack of sugar. So it's not recognized by the body because it's obviously not supposed to be there. That causes an autoimmune reaction. So we have large clusters of autoimmune, kind of because the body produces autoantibodies to attack these IgA antibodies. And these large clusters, who actually should probably be cleared by the liver, are not. And so they do end up depositing in the kidney, and this is actually what causes the problem. Each kidney has about 1 million glomeruli, which is really the filtration stations of the kidney. And as these deposit, they also then cause, it starts a kind of a cascade of inflammatory events. And this ultimately will lead to fibrosis, necrosis, etc. of these glomeruli, which will then start impacting the kidney's ability to filter waste. So what have we done in order to then try to deliver a very targeted medication in the specific area of the ileum? So we have a unique two-step formulation, which is a capsule that's coated in a way that it remains intact as it goes through the stomach and most of the small intestine. And it then has a very kind of rapid onset where it delivers most of its drug, virtually all of the drug load, in a very, very kind of targeted area over a brief period of time. In order to therefore affect this kind of production of IgA antibodies at the source. And what we're using is an active ingredient called budesonide, and you might be familiar with this from asthma. It's the same exact type of idea. You do something, you inhale this drug for asthma, and it treats the local mucosa in your lungs. Same thing here, we're treating the local mucosa in the gut. And what we do is budesonide has another kind of benefit in terms of being a very local and potent drug. When it's had its action in the ileum, it goes straight to the liver, and there it gets basically deactivated in first-pass metabolism at about 90%. So only 10% of the drug actually reaches the systemic circulation, where it can result in some side effects. So we're really having the best of both worlds in terms of very strong, local, potent delivery of a drug and a benign safety profile. So I did mention the phase 2b trial that we'd run. So this is the data that I mentioned was published in The Lancet. So what we did is we ran an 8 milligram, 16 milligram of budesonide and a placebo arm. As I mentioned, it was 150 patients, and it was 62 sites in 10 countries on a pan-European trial. And what we saw is that in the 16 milligram arm, there was a 30% reduction of proteinuria. And this is exactly what happens when these glomeruli get destroyed, is that the kidney, basically these membranes start leaking, and you start getting protein into the urine and blood into the urine. And this is a symptom of the fact that your kidney is not working as it should and that it's damaged. So proteinuria is a symptom of this disease, and what we can show is that we had a 30% reduction of that in the 16 milligram arm. And actually, more importantly, if you look to the right there, it says secondary endpoint, stabilization of eGFR. So this shows actually that the treated patient populations did not see any further deterioration of their kidney function, whilst the placebo group continued to decline by about 4.7 milliliters per minute, which is a typical kind of reduction that you see in these patients, and you've seen this in plenty other trials where there's been a placebo arm. And this is obviously what's key, is that, by doing this, our goal is obviously to be disease modifying and therefore be able to give a medication that will keep these patients out of dialysis and transplantation. In terms of tolerability, it was well tolerated. A vast majority of adverse events were either mild or moderate. And we didn't see any of those type of problems or adverse events which would concern physicians and obviously also patients with this type of class of drug, which basically relates to severe infections and impact on the metabolic system, such as new diabetes, weight gain, blood pressure raising. We didn't see any of those kind of more concerning side effects. So what we're doing now is running a phase 3, which is a virtual copy of the phase 2b. So this is a global trial. But the design is virtually the same. So just as in phase 2b, all patients come in on an optimized and stable dose of RAS blockade. So this is blood pressure lowering agents, and in most CKD patients, you will have as a kind of normal standard of care to try and put them on a blood pressure lowering agents in order to take the pressure off an organ that clearly is having some issues. And in this case, obviously, there's leakage over a damaged membrane, so taking the pressure off that would make sense. So they're then randomized to 16 milligrams or placebo. And what we're randomizing 200 patients, which we require in order for us to read out the top-line data, as I mentioned, is in Q4 this year. And on the basis of that positive data, hopefully, which we will see, we will then be able to file for regulatory approval both in the US and Europe. So this is the same kind of dosage as in phase 2b. It's an oral, once a day, 16 milligrams, same duration, 9 months, same endpoint. So it's reduction of proteinuria, that's the approvable endpoint. Key secondary supportive is EGFR. So the design from that perspective is very, very similar. The only kind of difference that has changed from the phase 2b is that we're taking in a slightly sicker patient population as we have adapted to guidelines which have been issued between the phase 2b and the phase 3 trial. So in terms of the timeline, as I mentioned, first patient in this trial was in November 2018. It was fully recruited for 200 patients in the end of December last year. And we are then looking to read out top-line data in Q4 and then file for approval. What you see as well, though, is that there is a second readout of something called Part B. So if we go back here, we see that actually once we have filed for approval, there is a post-market approval obligation that drug development companies have when they're using a surrogate marker. And that means that we will continue to recruit patients. So we are continuing to recruit patients today. So this year, we're looking to recruit an additional 160 patients. And on that basis, we will then be able to read out a follow-up period, which is 1 year long in Part B, where it's really just observational. There's no drug being delivered during that time. It's a simple observational period where we will actually study and see what is the long-term impact on EGFR, so actually the underlying kidney function post-dosing with this medication. So there has obviously been quite a lot of discussions about COVID-19 in the last several months. And as some of you might have seen in terms of a press releases, that this is obviously, it is an oral drug. The trial was fully recruited to 200 patients in December. This is also something where there's not a significant it's not a high touch interaction with the healthcare system. So patients really need to have maybe a 3-monthly follow-up. And so we actually have been in a position to put in place a lot of various kind of analysis and mitigating actions to ensure that we can focus obviously on patient safety as well as of the kind of trial, the data integrity of the trial. And so we're very, very happy to be able to say that actually the impact that we've had so far on the trial has not been significant, and that we are able to continue to hold our timelines in terms of the readout for Q4 this year. So in terms of commercialization, we are looking to commercialize ourselves in the US, and we are looking to partner ex-US. And so ex-US, we have already entered into a partnership in China. We did that last year. It was a $121 million deal with a $15 million upfront. And actually, in December of last year, we also got an additional milestone from that relationship, based on the fact that the Chinese regulatory authorities, accepted the IND, which means that China actually can be part of our phase 3, and will start recruiting patients this year, and which will go towards the goal of the 160 total patients that we're looking to recruit this year. In terms of the US, we have built up a separate team of senior staff in the US already that really covers all the kind of pre-commercial, commercial, market access, medical affairs, et cetera, so that we are making all the preparations for a launch in the US post filing and approval, hopefully. And in the other areas, we'll be looking at either development or commercial partners as we move forward. And in terms of the market size, I will go through some of the market research that we've done that's ended up, allowing us to look at this. But obviously, as we mentioned, in the U.S. alone, there are about 130 to 150,000 patients. We know that up to 50% of these patients will end up progressing and being at risk of end-stage renal disease. So that gives us a core kind of target population of 60 to 70,000 patients. And also through market research that we've done with payers in the U.S., the actual kind of price range where we basically will be managed as a typical specialty product, which is what we expect, is around $55,000 to $85,000 per treatment cycle. This leads to the kind of $9 to $10 billion total market estimate, and the $4.5 to $5 billion then the actual core market target estimate. So we believe that, since we are the first company to have concluded recruitment in a phase 3, we're also the first company globally to be able to read out a phase 3. We think we're very well positioned to have a significant impact in terms of being able to finally deliver to these patients a medication that's actually designed specifically to treat IgA nephropathy with an attractive risk-reward benefit. So what did we do in order to look at the market in the US? So we worked with IQVIA. They did a third-party market research, and this involved over 100 nephrologists in the US. And obviously, we have the benefit, since we actually have data in this indication, to show a profile that is going to be very similar to the data that we would file on. And the majority of nephrologists, which from a market research perspective is actually very high, indicated that this is a product that they would describe pretty much immediately. They don't need to wait for guidelines or publications or anything else. And they would basically prescribe it early. So they would prescribe it as soon as they thought that it was possible, either directly or in conjunction with ACEs and ARBs. And these ACEs and ARBs, again, is really the blood pressure lowering agents I was mentioning before. The profile was actually given to them without talking about the active ingredient, and after, when that was revealed, it said, would knowing that this was budesonide, would that change your perspective? Actually, it made the physicians even more favorable to the product. This is something that they know what it does, they're familiar with it, they feel comfortable managing their patients on this, and this we thought was a very interesting finding as well. So obviously, we also asked them, how would you treat this patient population? And they did end up in pretty much two kind of buckets. One saying, it's an autoimmune disease. If the patients are tolerating it and I'm getting results, I will keep my patients on that drug. And another kind of cluster of nephrologists who really felt like having a more intermittent treatment, because this is a long-term disease, is something that they would favor. So we're basically in two different kind of broad categories. So we also then obviously talked to the payers. This was also a large study involving over 225 million lives covered in the US that IQVIA carried out. And obviously, this is an orphan disease. There's nothing approved. So obviously, the payers are not familiar with this. But they were then given basically a profile as well as some background of the disease. And what the result from the market research is that they would treat this as a specialty product, which it is. So it would be prescribed by specialists, which it is, because all these patients are with nephrologists. They would like to know that the patient has the disease, which seems to be very reasonable. And they would also, some of them actually look to have a step through the kind of ACEs and ARBs. So again, looking at having patients either on or previously being on kind of blood pressure lowering agents. They would obviously, because it's not something they're familiar with, they invited interactions with KOLs, learning more about the disease and understanding this better. And a lot of different kind of price points were tested, and also just their unaided kind of view in terms of where this should be priced. And in this kind of range of $55,000 to $85,000 is where it's pretty much indifferent in terms of this is the type of way that they would treat the specialty product. And they also, very importantly, confirmed that, yes, they would reimburse this immediately as it became approved, even if this was on a kind of conditional or accelerated basis. We also looked at the actual market, so what does this market look like from a kind of KOL perspective. So this was a different company that carried out this research, which then identified that about 3,800 nephrologists today in the US interact with kind of IgA patients, look after IgA patients. But if you look at the 200 kind of top KOLs in this market, you'll see that they have a first-degree connection with 90% of this entire community. So what does that mean? So it means that they're either in the same institution, they've authored a paper together, they're on the same board. So actually it's a very concentrated market, which is something that you often find with rare diseases, and this is no exception. So with this, we basically believe that we need about 40 salespeople in the US in order to cover that market efficiently and effectively with regards to reach and frequency. We also have a couple of other indications in the pipeline, same kind of platform, same kind of active ingredient. We can look at this in terms of targeting autoimmune hepatitis, potentially, which is an orphan indication of the liver, also an autoimmune disease. We know, as I said before, we know that this goes straight from the gut to the liver. So we know that the liver is exposed, and it's a very targeted way of getting it there. Today, there's nothing approved in AIH. And basically, patients are generally treated off-label with systemic steroids such as prednisone or prednisolone, with significant side effects and difficulty in terms of compliance. There's also primary biliary cholangitis, also an autoimmune disease, also in the liver, but in this case, it's the biliary ducts that are targeted. So there are a couple of approved medications for this, FXR agonists, so UDCA and Ocaliva. But our kind of treatment approach would be to really go for the origin of the disease, to try and prevent this kind of anti-inflammatory immune kind of response to start, really kind of driving this effect on the biliary ducts. So in terms of milestones, to start wrapping up, so this is what we have delivered to date. What we've talked about is obviously that we have a Q4 top-line readout that we're targeting for our phase 3 trial, and then regulatory filing subsequent to that, both in the US and in Europe. And I should mention actually also in Europe that we have obviously been in conversations with EMA on this, not just with FDA. FDA just happened to agree to the surrogate marker first, based on the information and the statistical framework that we developed and then was published. But we have also interacted with the EMA, obviously, who says that based on the data that we are due to deliver in our top-line readout, they can see a way for us to get conditional approval, obviously, in Europe as well. We're also looking to complete the recruitment of our Part B, and we will have regulatory pathway kind of discussions with regards to our pipeline. And also China will start, hopefully in this year, also contribute to the recruitment and randomization of patients. And we're also looking very actively at in-licensing at least one new project this year in order to broaden our platform and to really continue to build an orphan kind of focused, broader kind of specialty pharma company with kind of R&D and development over here in Europe and a commercial arm in the US. So with this, I think I will finish here and then take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Renée. So in the interest of time, we'll keep the Q&A session very short. So just as we approach the readout, the top-line results in Q4, could you perhaps guide investors on how they should think about the results in terms of what you view as a good result or as perhaps a less ideal result in terms of because obviously the efficacy will, in a sense, also be guiding the potential uptake and how quickly uptake could be and such. Obviously, there's a big unmet medical need, but still, just to interpret the results from your point of view would be interesting.
Sure. So I think that what we've tried to do, obviously, is as far as possible to make as few changes between the phase 2b and phase 3. So actually, the design, as I kind of pointed out, was quite similar. We do have we have a bigger patient population. So we have 200 patients instead of 150. And obviously, we also have a broader geographic spread of the trial compared to the phase 2b. But because we're not talking about huge differences here, we're not kind of going from a couple of patients to a 3,000 patient trial, and we're not making lots of changes. I guess from our perspective, we're looking to get results which are similar to the phase 2b. So generally, what you can expect is maybe some dilution of the of the kind of effect as you go to a slightly bigger population and broader population. But I mean, that's probably what we would expect to see. And I think that would be a great outcome, because at the end of the day, if we can show in this study as well that actually by giving this medication to patients, we can actually prevent their kidney from deteriorating any further. That obviously is really what physicians and patients are ultimately interested in. It's great to have a surrogate marker and to look at that symptom, but at the end of the day, it's obviously about being kidney protective and actually preventing these patients from having to go into dialysis and transplantation.
Excellent. So thank you very much. We'll have to cut it short there, but thank you very much, and best of luck with the clinical program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.